Thank you for watching this video from the Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue at Carleton University. This event is sponsored by the Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue, CETD, and the Faculty of Public Affairs Research Month at Carleton University. CETD receives funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The views expressed in this video are solely those of the presenter and do not reflect the views of the CETD, SSHRC, or Carleton University.
Yeah, first of all, thank you also first to Joan, in the same way like Arte, for bringing me into this cluster and also inviting me for this wrap-up event. And also, of course, to Marcel and Dara for all this organizational effort that they have put into this. Before I begin, we were asked to prepare a presentation that somehow speaks to the work of Donna and Amy Verdun. So I pondered a lot how I should approach this thing. What I eventually did is a very sort of sweeping kind of analysis, comparing dynamics in Europe as well as in Canada, in order to point to important divergent trends here that I find interesting. And also maybe a second remark that leads to the presentation. My family and we've moved to Canada 2.5 years ago, a little bit more actually. Which is some time, but not a very long time, and it's interesting to think about how much has changed within these 2.5 years, both in Europe as well as in Canada. So when we left Europe was still like under this discussion, or dominated by this discussion of the Eurozone crisis primarily. No one had the immigration refugee crisis on his or her radar. In Canada, I teach a second-year course, Canadian Politics, using, among other things, the Big Shift book or Dynasties and Interludes. We thought we would still live on the Harper government era. So that's what we had expected. No one had expected that we are now having a liberal majority government, and even more so a liberal majority government who seems to be quite ambitious. So that is interesting from a transformative or politics change perspective, and maybe somehow also influences the way how I approach this paper, because at the same time I'm now looking at European events with the distance from Canada, and before that I was looking at Canadian politics from Europe. So my structure, before I start with the structure, I would like to showcase just maybe two recent sort of illustrations or anecdotes about my topic, boundary control. The first one is the Spiegel from this week. That would be the Maclean's equivalent in Canada, which is titled Wir schaffen das, und dann small, offene Europa ab und riskieren unsere Zukunft. So, well, this is a little bit difficult to translate, because the Wir schaffen das is a quote of Angela Merkel when she defended her stance in the refugee policy. We are able to do it. We are capable of solving these problems. And at the same time, in this context, it means like we're abolishing the open Europe and, well, put our future at risk. And of course, the picture should symbolize this, which in a sense somehow speaks to the topic of boundaries. And I will just outline briefly what I mean by that. And the second one is one of those pictures that we have been seeing more and more frequently lately. That's an example from the Austrian-Slovenian border, where individual member states of the European Union and also non-European member state governments decide to re-erect real boundaries, border fences, to somehow block the stream of refugees moving forward into like Central Northern Europe. It was also yesterday evening on the National very interesting to see. They were reporting from a camp in Greek, and then like as a sort of follow-up to this report, they just displayed a map which highlighted in red where individual governments, Macedonia and others, began to redraw boundaries. So boundaries apparently are really important for politics in different ways. For example, first of all, they delimit a territorial sort of entity, a site of political action, political site, where authority applies. they confine the reach of political decisions, and at the same time they enable governments to determine, for example, how permeable a boundary is by deciding what amount and what types of goods, beds, entries, exits should actually pass a border or not. So that is a general starting point. If we take a look at Canadian politics, we see also the importance of boundaries. When we take, for example, the Council of the Federation meeting 2 years ago, and also in 2014 it came up again, when Kathleen Wynne and Christy Clark from BC sort of tried to resolve an ongoing internal trade dispute. The problem is that, or not the problem is, but the problem that Christy Clark wanted to showcase here was she brought several bottles of BC wine to the meeting in Niagara and showcased that it is really not impossible, but very difficult and even sort of a legal gray zone for people to bring wine from British Columbia to Ontario. And it's in fact true if you walk through an LCBO, you get wine from Austria, France, whatever, but it's difficult to find wine from BC. So again, borders somehow matters, not only in Europe, but also in Canada. And I would like to make 3 brief points here. First, I would like to briefly talk about this issue or this idea of boundary controls in multi-level systems. Second, I would like to very briefly apply this to Canada and Europe historically. And then I would like to, also make this point that apparently we are witnessing an era that has just started where long-term historical trajectories seem to shift, or at least the dynamic seems to shift. What does boundary control mean? It goes back to the work of Stein Rocken, also Derek, in collaboration with Derek Urban. It was picked up again in the 2000s, especially scholars from Italy wrote, in my view, really remarkable and extremely inspiring books on European integration. For example, Stefano Bartolini, Maurizio Ferreira, and one should also maybe add Sergio Fabrini, who used this Rocanian framework of center formation, where a center tries to establish a new political system, a new political entity, by sort of subordinating peripheries. And they built on this framework to explain the European Union. First of all, Bartolini as a really long sort of historical transformative process, a new transformative process in Europe that is, in a sense, a new center formation, a new sort of instance of center formation where boundaries are transcended. That means boundaries between the member states are shifted to the next level. A new boundary on the European level is created, although it's still a weak boundary. But this means what we see is a gradual removal of domestic boundaries, domestic within the European Union, and what they call political structuring. That means the establishment of new political systems on the level of the European Union, where member states are sort of have the opportunity to influence decision making. Ferreira does use the same framework, but focuses more on social welfare by arguing that we observe a redrawing of social citizenship boundaries through European integration. That means, like, to some extent, European citizens becoming also entitled to certain European social standards. A more recent book that also picks it up and makes boundary control more explicit is the book by Gibson, who investigates the question, examines the question why authoritarian enclaves can survive in federal democracies. And he uses 3 examples: the United States, the Old South, Argentina, and Mexico, and develops a more fine-grained analytical toolkit of how we can use different strategies of boundary control. That means authoritarian elites on the sub-level use their power over boundaries in different ways to protect them from democratization. For example, through what he calls the parochialization of power. That means they really shield themselves from, like, democratic imperatives from the center, or they try to influence national institutions, like, for example, the Southern Democrats in the Senate, or they try to monopolize linkages, like intergovernmental relation systems. So how does this apply to Canada? Oh no, first of all, I would sort of pull out two lessons here. We can distinguish two effects or two strategies or versions of boundary controls. First of all, direct, where sub-level actors simply use their control over domestic boundaries and multi-level systems to shield themselves from encroachments of the center or other territorial units. They want to, in other words, preserve or enhance local autonomy through self-rule. And the second is a more indirect, and this one doesn't really appear, at least to my knowledge, in the work of Bartolini and Rockham. It's a more anticipatory effect. So boundary control can also be used as a strategic leverage to demand concessions from the center. So sub-level units concede to open up their boundaries a little bit or suspend their control, their authority over their domestic boundaries in exchange for stronger participation rights at the center. And that means we have more shared rule because, yeah, they're more engaged on the central level. So if we apply this to Canada, we see, and this is really a very sweeping kind of interpretation, I would argue that the first mode has dominated over the history, or was the main dynamic at work. Canada, as we all know, started as a highly centralized federalization that has developed through several waves of decentralization towards a much more decentralized pole, and therefore one could argue that the provinces were able to considerably enhance their capacities of boundary control over time directly. Often supported in the beginning through the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, which gave, for example, the Property and Civil Rights Clause a very broad and extensive interpretation. So this enabled them to establish effective firewalls against federal intrusion. In the past, the Peace, Order, and Good Government Clause, the powers of reservation, and then in the more recent history, like second half of the 20th century, the spending power, which was still, it did work, but however, they were also able to sort of use their boundary control to shield themselves. Implications, and this speaks maybe to the work also of Donna Wood and Amy Verdun in a more general way. This is why one could argue also we observe rather weak shared rule mechanisms in Canada, in particular when it comes to the system of intergovernmental relations, which is in fact rather weak and highly volatile, as well as the weak Senate. Europe, in contrast, was much more driven by a dynamic that emphasized the second mode, this indirect boundary controls, where the member states voluntarily, or in other cases because they were compelled by the European level, sort of had to cede their boundary control, but at the same time they were able to maintain or even strengthen intergovernmental mechanisms, or even like their shared rule power at the central level. So there were two different ways: negative integration driven by the European Commission and the European Court of Justice, and also positive integration where we often see the more voluntary mode, like in the case of Schengen, for example, which then became part of the acquis, or the Schengen acquis. So again, like they ceded or suspended their authority over boundaries, but at the same time they retained a strong presence at the center. And I would suggest that this dynamic was endured until the Euro crisis, more or less, because again, we learned about this yesterday and today, especially this morning. We have a range of new mechanisms which are very forceful and in effect limit the boundary control of the member states. Implications: comparatively strong shared rule mechanisms, intergovernmental, but also on the European level. What is interesting now, how many is this? Two? A couple more, okay, I speed it up. That I would suggest, as I started, we observe something like a transformation here. In Canada, it started more or less, maybe at least at the level of rhetoric, with collaborative federalism. There was SUFA, the National Child Benefit and the multilateral agreement for childcare that was launched under Paul Martin. Depending on the sector, they were to some extent successful. SUFA definitely not. But at least we saw something happening here, which was, however, more or less neglected or even abolished under Harper. Another sector where we can see like greater willingness maybe to concede boundary control is internal and external trade policy, especially internal trade policy is important here with, for example, the New West Partnership Trade Agreement and also the more recent effort to renew the agreement on internal trade. CETA would be the example for external trade where provinces accept that they cannot use their boundary control any longer in certain areas, but therefore they can influence the decision-making process. Council of the Federation would be maybe another horizontal example, and then of course the new liberal government, which apparently tries to induce the system of intergovernmental relations with new life. Most importantly, the climate change framework, but there are many other examples as well. In Europe, we see rather the opposite, an effort to, again, gain control over boundaries domestically, again, which has different reasons. I very briefly skim them and then I'll stop or wrap it up. Amplification of cleavages. We have north versus south. That is a historical one. Another historical one is the UK versus the rest of Europe. But then more recently, what became manifest is West versus Central East Europe, especially the Visegrad group. Then the erosion or potential demise of the Schengen acquis. We will see how far this will get. Reimposed border controls through several member states, new border fences, and maybe also the UK EU deal could be an example here for an attempt to reestablish boundaries on the domestic level. Two concluding remarks, which might be more concluding questions, because this is something that I just begin to think about a little bit more in a deeper way. The question is, if we accept that it's true that there are shifting dynamics in both systems, the question is how strong is the heavy hand of history? Schengen is here to stay. That was Juncker's point in December 2015. He was very confident. We also sort of realized that yesterday morning with the ambassador. I think, and probably I would probably agree with them, Europe is here to stay. So despite all these new dynamics, there's a strong path dependency and other retarding mechanisms at work that counteract here. What interesting would be the question, what is the variance in Canada and Europe? So are retarding elements in Canada stronger or in Europe, or the other way around? And then, of course, the overarching topic to which I just spoke implicitly here, what does this all mean in terms of democratic legitimacy? Is there something like a right balance between boundary opening and boundary enclosure in multi-level systems? I leave it as a question. Obviously, I would say there's no right balance. It's highly contingent, but this is something one would have to specify. Thank you.